right, welcome back everyone. Great that you are joining us again after the break. I hope you enjoyed the presentations as much as I did, the first presentations, and we're just going to keep putting the energy up. And our next speaker is Marshall Geiger, and he will be he is a PhD, a CPA, and he is CSX Chair in Management and Accounting and Professor of Accounting at the Robbins School of Business, University of Richmond. Marshall has also been an honorary professor of the Faculty of Business and Law at Deakin University in Australia. He is an acclaimed researcher in accounting and auditing and served as an auditor at Auditing, a journal of practice and theory, and a former associate editor of Accounting Horizons, and also appointed on 5 editorial review boards of scholarly journals in the US and internationally. He published his work in all major accounting journals. So he's quite acclaimed, you could say. Marshall has made a large contribution to the auditing literature, looking at fees and activities that auditors perform. For instance, how auditing and non-auditing activities are related in terms of audit services. Today, he's going to talk about what we know from growing concerns opinions. We believe this topic is of particular interest in the conditions we are facing today. The title of his presentation is very short, Growing Concern Opinions, and I'm very much looking forward to your presentation, Marshall. Welcome to the conference, and great that you can present today.
Well, thank you, Jan. Thank you for having me, and I just look forward to the rest of the conference. The first presentations were wonderful. So let me see if I can kind of share my screen. Just some thoughts, and again, thank you, Jan and the FAR, for allowing me to kind of give some thoughts and a research area that I've done research for several years now. So I appreciate it. Now, what I'd like to do is to first kind of take a quick walk down memory lane, and the characters there kind of trying to push back time. And as you now know that I am not technologically savvy, I would have liked to have had some music, strolling music, playing in the background as we kind of take our stroll back in time. So let's go back to 2019. You know, what a great year. World stock markets were uniformly performing pretty well. The general global economic outlook was fairly bright. Of course, there was that nagging, Brexit thing, and U.S.-China trade tensions, here and there throughout the year. But all in all, it was a pretty good economic year. And going concern, modified opinions, GCOs, from auditors in the U.S., from audit analytics data, and I think pretty universally worldwide, was at a 10-year low, reflecting the relative broad business financial health kind of globally. And then we entered 2020. Yikes. After a smooth start, things got messy pretty quick. So here are some selected headlines from the Wall Street Journal and the CFO Journal from Wall Street and the Financial Times. So undoubtedly, these are from my US biased perspective, but I tried to minimize that as best I could. But as Anna and Tammy just kind of talked about, I'm sure that I didn't minimize them all the way. So 10th of February, smaller U.S. firms struggle to get workers despite a strong job market. 13th of February, global central bankers adopt a cautious outlook on the coronavirus. 14th of February, the White House proposes to fold the PCAOB into the SEC. I haven't heard anything more on that. It didn't really get a whole lot of traction, so that was kind of eons ago at this point. February 25th, global stock market slide as the virus spreads in Europe. March 4th, the death toll in the US rises to 11 as the virus spreads in California and New York. March 13th, the Dow suffers its worst day since 1987, so the flash crash of October 1987. 24th of March, companies like FedEx, GE, Starbucks, American Eagle, and Zillow withdraw guidance due to uncertainties surrounding COVID-19. March 27th, the US passes the $2.2 trillion CARES Act for COVID-19 relief for businesses and individuals. April 5th, Boris Johnson is admitted to the hospital with COVID-19. The 9th of April, the SEC urges companies to be transparent in their COVID-19 disclosures. April 15th, the world economy is forecast to contract 3.0% in 2020. And the US personal tax filing date is moved from April 15th to July 15th. April 16th, Citigroup increases its loan loss reserves from $278 million to $4.92 billion, an increase of 1,700%. Actually, it's 1,699 point something percent, just a massive increase. 17th of April, US jobless claims now at 22 million in the fourth week of the shutdown. 21st of April, US crude oil prices go negative for the first time ever. US crude oil manufacturers could not have, they ran out of space to store their oil, so they actually had to pay organizations to take it off their hands. April 22nd, over 18 million workers in Europe idled. 27th, France, Spain, Italy, and US moved to ease lockdown restrictions, and Boris Johnson has got his first day back on the job. April 28th, HSBC profits are half their normal, and loan loss provisions increased by just a mere 400%. 30th of April, the US economy shrank 4.8% in Q1 of 2020. Royal Dutch Shell cuts its dividend for the first time since World War II. The 4th of May, European and US banks book more than $50 billion in loan losses in the first quarter of 2020, and ExxonMobil posts its first quarterly loss in 30 years. 5th of May, global deaths from COVID-19 top 250,000. May 6th, the Wall Street Journal publishes an article, Going Concern Opinions Poised for a Comeback. So I showed that to my wife, who's a licensed clinical social worker, and Sue says, of course, the going concern opinions are going to be poised for a comeback. The 7th of May, European Commission estimates the contraction at 7.75% of GDP so far for 2020, and notes that it was 4.5% in the global financial crisis of 2007, 2008. 13th of May, the US Fed Chair Powell says that more measures may be necessary to prevent long-term damage. 18th of May, India extends their lockdown, and the finance minister suspends all bankruptcy cases for up to 1 year. So the concern was to not panic the markets. They're actually going to delay filings for COVID-related bankruptcies. May 22nd, the financial statement fraud risk increases due to COVID-19. So the article goes on and talks about the risks are from internal control disruptions, people working at home and not in the workplace, so disrupting the normal control flows, and market pressures, the ever-present pressure to show good market results or the best possible market results, even amid this global pandemic. May 28th, the US jobless claims hit 40 million. 1st of June, UK banks warn up to 50% of the COVID-19 loans may default, with hundreds of thousands of failed businesses in the UK alone. 8th of June, Germany reports historic 18% tumble in output in April, which is the largest 1-month decline on record. June 9th, the World Bank expects global economy to shrink 5.2%. And the US Fed expects it to shrink 6.5% for 2020. But nonetheless, in the same day, US stocks erase the 2020 losses, and the NASDAQ goes over 10,000 for the first time in its history. So the stock market regains all of the lost ground and then some. June 11th, global stocks fall amid gloomy employment outlook. So this is like 2 days later. June 12th, the UK economy shrinks by 20% in April. The 15th of June, global equity markets shrink amid a surge of COVID-19 cases in the US and China. And then the next day on the 16th, global equity markets rally in hopes of fresh US stimulus measures, and US retail sales are up 18% in May over April's numbers. June 17th, the Bank of England forecast to unleash at least £100 billion in extra stimulus. And at the same time, the UK public debt is greater than 100% of GDP. And then just last Thursday, on the 18th, more than 45 million in the US have filed for unemployment. So kind of a quick kind of run through of some of the very, very top point headlines. The memories. Seems like we were just kind of hanging on. So what will the immediate business future look like? And the big question about a month into all of this was, what will the shape of the recovery look like? You know, will it be a V? Will it be a U with a little flatter bottom? Will it be a W with kind of 2 dips and then kind of eventually back? Will it be an L with just a decline, and then we kind of flatline at that for a long time? Will it be an infinity loop going back and forward, up and down forever, which is probably going to be my prediction for kind of the closest to the truth. So what do the experts think? So if we look at Mark Wilson from Morgan Stanley's Chief Investment Officer from the Financial Times on June 3rd, historically economies frequently experience V-shaped recovery after a recession. The severity of this particular recession, combined with the unprecedented policy response, makes it unlikely we will see anything but a V-shaped recovery this time. In the same article, Eric Nielsen, UniCredit's chief global economist, says, attempting to forecast the economic effects of the lockdown is truly a fool's game. Never before have we seen a man-made recession of this scale, nor have we seen policy responses of this magnitude to cushion the impact on people's livelihood. On balance, however, I expect the biggest peacetime recession in almost 100 years. So these are just illustrative of the disparity of opinion among the experts that actually kind of live and breathe this stuff. So they don't know. I'm not sure if anyone truly knows. So what will business look like after the new normal is established, whether it's a V, a U, a W, an L? And what does this mean for auditors and their opinions with respect to going concern? Well, taking a look at the plethora of new COVID-19 practice guidance issued, sometimes more than once, by just about every public and private auditor regulatory body, as well as Association of Public Auditors on Earth, evidently it means pretty much exactly the same thing after COVID-19 as it did before COVID-19. There's essentially nothing new as far as regulations, standards, or the responsibility of auditors in the COVID-19 guidance that was not in place prior to COVID-19. Nothing significantly added or kind of taken away, with the exception of the deference of some implementation of some already adopted auditing and financial reporting standards, if you kind of look at the reporting side. But I think that's a good thing. I think that's a very good thing. It, to me, indicates that we believe that the fundamental underlying approach to going concern issues is sound, even when stress tested, kind of extremely stress tested. The new guidance reminds us to be diligent auditors, to follow the existing standards, and that this is especially difficult right now. But the world is very interested and will be watching. So I still find that the guidance is helpful because it focuses discussion on the difficult issues involved in determining whether a GCO is appropriate. So a hyper-focused discussion provides more explicit, detailed discussion of audit evidence to consider when deciding the appropriate reporting on going concern uncertainties, and is helpful both in determining the appropriateness of a GCO as well as the appropriate use and disclosure in the accompanying CAMs and emphasis of matter paragraphs. I also find it pretty interesting that the ACAEW in the UK issued guidance, quote unquote, for investors on how to interpret auditor GCOs and related disclosures, especially with the expected increase in the number of GCOs and going concern related CAMs and emphasis of matter paragraphs that investors are likely to encounter. Back in 1982, the AICPA, well before the PCAOB, came out with a pamphlet called Understanding Audits and Audit Opinions that was designed just for investors and kind of unsophisticated users. It was an early part of their expectations gap kind of projects trying to get people to understand what auditors do. So this is in that same ilk in my book. And I think it's noteworthy and actually a good service. We often see things for audit committees, certainly for auditors, but to kind of educate investors and other non-sophisticated auditing people what an audit is and what these going concern opinions are actually trying to say, and the related disclosures, I think, is a good thing. Now, this is my favorite quote from the pandemic, and this was something that I read on my phone, sitting in the airport in San Pedro, Belize, waiting to come back to the US at the end of my spring break when we were down kind of celebrating my wife's birthday. And this has nothing to do, this was the FAR conference is kind of a Dutch conference. But when responding to questions regarding the country's response to the pandemic, the Dutch Prime Minister, Mark Rutte, replied that all decisions have been made with the scientific insights available at the moment. And in crises like these, you have to make 100% of the decisions with 50% of the knowledge and bear the consequences. And that was in the Netherlands Times on Thursday, March 12th. So I read that in the airport and I thought, now, isn't that exactly the issue for auditors when we face going concern uncertainties? Pretty much all the time, but particularly now. You base the decision on known facts and circumstances at the time. You make 100% of the decision with only 50% or maybe less knowledge of the course or even the possibility of future events. And you bear the consequences of the decision.
Marcel, you'll get 5 more minutes.
Okay. So even if a client company's business seems to be going well, what do you do when they radically change their business models, when they how you have to assess their preparedness for future business disruptions, to ensure that their financial statements are correct. What do you do to look past just the immediate 2 to 3 months? What do you do to decide when to do the going concern review? And how do you account for any government aid that the clients have gotten? So I will, hopefully the FAR will allow me to make these slides available for you after this. So let me jump ahead to COVID-19 related GCO research questions. Prior research in general has found that an increase in GCO rates increases the type 1 error. So type 1 errors in academia are GCOs without subsequent failure. And the research has found that when rates go up, type 1 errors go up, but we don't have a whole lot of decrease in type 2 errors, which are failures without a prior going concern opinion. So my question is, will the inevitable increase in GCOs due to the pandemic result in a similar pattern? Or will there simply be more business failures in the next few years, leading to a decrease in the type 2 error rates? So those firms will get a going concern opinion in the period before. And also, how do you assess the accuracy of a 2019 audit report? Can the non-going concerns in 2019 for failed businesses in 2020 actually be considered a type 2 error? Are auditors kind of supposed to know this stuff? Will going concerns be overused, possibly as a way to limit legal liability? Will they be underused in hopes of reducing the self-fulfilling prophecy? In arriving at the GCO decision, will the same audit evidence be obtained and evaluated? And if not, what's added, what's removed? And will that evidence get the same weight in the GCO decision as before? So in essence, do the former going concern decision models hold in the pandemic or the post-pandemic period? Do we look at the same things and give them the same weights in coming up with the going concern decision? Do audit firms change their internal processes for GCO evaluation? And if so, how? And are they short-term changes or long-term changes? What additional work, if any, do you require clients to do to support evidence of their going concern viability? How do auditors use CAMs in the reporting of going concern uncertainties during the pandemic? And do these disclosures differ from the pre and post-pandemic period? Do auditors issue more qualified opinions and disclaimers associated with going concern during the pandemic? How often are uncertainties related to going concern mentioned in interim financial statements? This is an area that has not been researched that much in the past, the use of interim financial reporting as opposed to just annual financial reporting. And how are GCs related to specific financial statement items, intangibles, cash flow from operations, and so on? How are they related to non-financial items, ownership type, institutional settings, supply chain resilience, outside guarantors, industry differences? And importantly, how do auditor characteristics like experience levels at the partner in the team, industry experience, tenure with the client, perceptions of the self-fulfilling prophecy, willingness to challenge management and professional skepticism that we heard just prior with Tammy and Anna, confidence, other traits? How do they manifest in differences in evidence evaluation, GCO rates, and GCO error rates during the pandemic compared to the pre and post pandemic period? And then most importantly, what are the new or heightened issues faced by auditors actually making GCO decisions during these times? So what do you think? I love the FAR conferences. Unfortunately, this year's a little bit different, as we all know. But I love the FAR for the discourse between academics and practitioners. So hopefully we can have a little bit of that. And if you would like, please post your issues or comments or kind of what's new for things that were not typical before the pandemic. you can post them in the chat box, or you can send them to me at my email, mgeiger@richmond.edu. That's plenty from me. Thank you very much. And again, you can please kind of let me know through email or the chat box. Thanks, John.
Thank you very much, Marcel. This is for your very lively presentation. I would now like to give the word to Anna Lauwersen, and she is from practice, and she's a young professional at PwC, and she will lead the discussion of your presentation and the questions that are being asked today. So, Anna, the floor is yours.
Yes, thank you, Jan. And thank you, Marcel, for the interesting presentation. I think all the questions are very related to all the COVID-19 question in the area we live in right now. So feel free, everyone, to ask your questions or to send a response to the question to Marcel's email address. First, I want to ask a question by myself from PwC. We have a question. In the article, you are also mentioning about the differences between cultures, and you're mentioning about the USA and the Netherlands, and there's totally differences in regarding the principle-based versus the rule-based accounting. And also in the last, you are a recommendation is given about a guideline regarding decision making. But how do you see like the differences? Do you have a preference for one of the two regarding the decision making guideline? And do you see also differences between the going concern modified opinion of auditors in those two different environments? I'm interested in your opinion about that.
Well, thank you. So that's a great question. I wish I had a 5-second quick response. I think that there will be certainly differences. I also kind of teach financial reporting, so I think U.S. GAAP is not as principle or is as principle based as IFRS, and not kind of as rule based as it's been claimed to be. So I think there's a difference certainly in institutional setting, regardless of the focus of the financial reporting. So I think that institutional setting is a rich area that really just started to have been explored. But I don't have strong priors as to whether I would expect there to be more or less going concern opinions in an institutional environment that kind of supports investors more or less. That's why I think it's an interesting research question, but I think there will be differences. With respect to the actual decision model itself, that's where I think it'll be interesting to see in practice what does correlate highly with going concern opinions in the pandemic period that might have been different in the pre-pandemic period. As much as we can tell, certainly researchers can only analyze what we have access to. So that's where the public information versus private information kind of gets in the way. So I think it would be a truly interesting study to see within firms, to see how they have kind of changed either explicitly in the guidance or just implicitly in kind of what partners and what teams actually kind of look at. That's a little bit different now than it was before, and kind of what's weighted more heavily now than potentially prior.
Okay, thank you. One question from the audience. How do you see the role of the auditor in regards to the forward-looking information in the management discussion and analysis and the GAAP Corona disclosures, non-GAAP disclosures?
Well, since MD&A is not audited, the auditor's responsibility is basically to kind of review that, kind of read it, make sure it's consistent with their knowledge of the client and the other disclosures that are audited in the financial statements. But I think, that's kind of the technical answer. I think in reality, auditors dive a lot further into that than required, because it's kind of minimum standard requirements. So I think there'll be a lot of discussion between auditors and management on what's the appropriate tone for those disclosures, as well as kind of the extent of the discussion, and whether that leads to going concern, modified opinion, or whether that leads to a CAM, or whether that leads to an emphasis of matter. I think will be interesting to find out.
Yes, okay, thank you. Another question, in line with Mark Rutte, in how many of the cases are auditors right in issuing a going concern opinion?
So historically, I guess I can, from the US's perspective, for new going concern opinions, 90% are incorrect. 90% would be a type 1 error on average. So if you kind of look at that, only 10% of firms that get a new going concern opinion kind of fail within the next year. So if you look further out, that type 1 error rate drops down. For type 2 error rates, historically, in the US after SAS 58, the rate is around 50%. So it fluctuates, but about 50% of the bankruptcies or business failures would get a going concern opinion on the financial statements before they failed. So those are the kind of the historic rates. So it'll be interesting to see if they change.
Yes, exactly. Yes. And other interesting question, this was also on my list as well. There have been other pandemics in the past, the swine flu in 2009, the SARS in 2002. Are there any insights regarding GCOs were different during these periods?
On those, not that I know of. Some other colleagues and I had done a study on GCOs around the global financial crisis, because auditors were kind of accused of being asleep at the switch and not reporting as robustly as regulators had hoped. And but what we found is that the going concern rates during the global financial crisis even went up. So auditors were kind of better at catching firms that were going to eventually go bankrupt than they were right before it. But for the other kind of health crises, I don't remember seeing any research on that. So that would be kind of an interesting thing to go back and take a look at. But nothing kind of sticks out in my mind. But there is a group of research around the global financial crisis, 2008. So that is a good question.
Yes, okay, thank you. How do you see the role of the auditor when clients want to postpone the publication of their financial statement to avoid bringing the bad news, the self-fulfilling prophecy concerns? What's your opinion about that?
Yeah, it's kind of there has been some research that's found that when there's been a substantial lag in audit reporting and issuing the financial statements, that there's more likely to be a going concern opinion there. But it's kind of a chicken or the egg question. I mean, what comes before the other? Because I think they are intrinsically intertwined. I think there is just a sign that this is a difficult company for probably a lot of different reasons, one of which is financial. So that there's more likely to be a going concern opinion there, but it could be issues with management. It could be a lot of other things as well. But I think there's a tendency to wait to report bad news and kind of maybe delay the inevitable if possible. So I haven't seen a whole lot of experimental research that might look at the association between believing in the self-fulfilling prophecy and kind of delaying, intentionally delaying audit opinions or the release of financial information.
Okay, I think a lot of new research questions are popping up at the moment. How does the excess of cash affect the going concern opinion? Is that different now compared when we experience a regular economic crisis?
I think that would be an interesting question. I mean, we certainly have looked at the association of cash and cash flow from operations with going concern opinions in the past, but whether there needs to be more cash or stronger cash flow from operations now to kind of fend off the going concern is a great empirical question. So in 2 years, I will answer that. So we'll have some time to kind of look at the data.
On the next FAR conference, we will discuss that one.
Okay.
Yeah. Another question. What is your opinion on using the emphasis on the matter paragraph, the ISA 706, to communicate as an auditor the uncertainty we are facing?
I think this is a very interesting area to kind of communicate the uncertainty without necessarily giving the going concern modified opinion. I think is a middle ground that was one of my research questions. I think we might see that much more frequently in the pandemic than we did before. I think some firms used it, others might not have. So I think that we will see an increase in those emphasis of matter paragraphs as we try and kind of slice this as closely as possible when it kind of comes under the microscope, kind of what really kind of falls in a critical time in this bucket versus this bucket. So I think we will see kind of more of them, where before we might have just aggregated them with kind of no disclosure.
I think we have time for one more question. Sorry.
Yes, no problem. Maybe an interesting one as to close the session. What kind of intervention do you suggest to improve the accuracy of the going concern modified opinion decisions? What's your opinion about that?
My goodness, if I had that real quick, yeah, I'd be in business for myself, I think. That's really hard. I think, as certainly all practitioners know, every case is different. And that's where I think as researchers, it would be beneficial to get some of that kind of private information to use, because auditors have the public information and the private information that they meld together to make the decision. So as a researcher, to kind of get some of that private information and put it together with the public to get a more robust going concern model, I think would be very beneficial. And then, not disclose anything of privacy issues, but I think that would be kind of a goal of future research in this case. And I think that also would help in that previous question to figure out, with all of that information, where do auditors come down as far as emphasis of matter versus going concern versus not saying anything versus what's put in a CAM.
Yes, exactly. Okay, thank you for your time and thank you for asking all the questions. Maybe it's good to emphasize that you can reply on the questions you said in your presentation on COVID-19, and maybe we can answer the rest of the question in the podcast of the Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Anna, for the discussion of Marcel's presentation, and thank you, Marcel, very much for your presentation. I think we're all looking for the crystal ball, and we know that it is not available, right? So it is really a fascinating area now to discuss. And we were not able to answer all the questions that are actually put out here that we know of, but we will take care of those indeed during the podcast.